The town of Garnet Crossing sat at the bottom of a long valley where two dry creek beds met and pretended, in spring, to be a river. By October, the pretending was over. The creek beds were dust, and the cottonwoods along their banks were going yellow, and the wind that came down from the northern mesa carried with it the first serious suggestion of winter, cold and clean and without mercy. It was not a welcoming town. It had not been built for welcome. It had been built for survival, which was a different project entirely, and it showed in every timber and every face. Nell Archer arrived on a Tuesday with a carpet bag, a canvas satchel full of tools, and a daughter who was not quite 4 years old and had slept through most of the journey from Albuquerque. The wagon driver set them down at the edge of the main street without ceremony and turned his rig around before the dust had settled behind them. Nell stood in the road with the bag in one hand and the satchel in the other, and her daughter Ida on her hip, blinking in the October light, and looked at Garnet Crossing. Garnet Crossing looked back with the particular expression of a place that has seen enough arrivals to be unimpressed by any of them. She was 36. Her hair was dark brown, worn in a braid that had come loose somewhere around the 3rd hour of the journey, and she had not gotten around to fixing it. Her dress was gray-blue homespun, washed to softness, with a fray at the left cuff she kept meaning to mend. Her hands were the hands of a woman who had done a great deal of work over a great many years, and had not thought of it as remarkable because it had simply been necessary. She had gray-green eyes and a jaw that people sometimes described as stubborn, and that she described as honest, because the difference between those two things depended entirely on whether you were the one holding the line or the one trying to move it. She had $42 and the tools in the satchel, and a letter from a man named Hector Pruitt, who ran the livery in Garnet Crossing, and who had written to the Farrier Guild in Albuquerque asking if they knew of any trained hand willing to relocate. The guild had written back with Nell's name, and Nell had written to Pruitt, and Pruitt had written back offering the use of the forge and a commission on any work she brought in. He had not asked whether she was a woman. She had not offered the information. There was a school of thought that said this was dishonest. Nell belonged to a different school, the one that said competence did not require an introduction. Hector Pruitt, when she found him at the livery, took the arrival of a female farrier with the expression of a man watching the sun rise in the west. He stood in the livery doorway with his mouth slightly open for a moment, and then he closed it and looked at Ida, and then at Nell, and then at the canvas satchel, and said, "You're the farrier from Albuquerque." "I am," Nell said. "You didn't mention." "The work is the same either way." He looked at the satchel again. He was a small, practical man in his 60s, who had been running a livery long enough to understand that horses did not care much about the opinions of people. He stepped back from the doorway. "Forge is in the back," he said. "There's a room above the tack room. It's not much." "I've had less," Nell said, and walked in. The room above the tack room was small and smelled of leather and old hay and the particular dry cold of a place that had not been heated in some time. There was a cot, a washstand, a small iron stove, and a window that looked out over the livery yard to the hills beyond. Nell set down the carpet bag and looked at the room and thought she had known worse, which was true, and that she could make something of it, which was also true. She settled Ida on the cot with the small cloth rabbit that went everywhere with her, and went downstairs to look at the forge. It was a good forge, properly built, well-maintained, with a bellows that had been recently repaired, and an anvil of quality that someone had looked after. Tools on the wall in good order, a bucket for the slack tub that was cracked but serviceable. She ran her hands over the anvil face and felt the smoothness of it, and something in her settled, the way it always settled when she was near a forge. Iron and fire and the particular logic of metal were the things she understood best in the world, and they had never once let her down. Her husband, Edmund, had been a farrier. She had learned at his side over 8 years of working ranch circuits across Texas and New Mexico, and she had been better at it than him by the 4th year, which was something they had both known and neither had discussed. Because Edmund was a proud man and Nell loved him, and there are kindnesses that wear the shape of silence. He had died 2 years ago of a lung fever that came on fast and left no room for argument. She had buried him in the red clay of the Pecos Valley and packed the tools and taken Ida and kept going, because that was what you did. That was the only thing there was to do. She had been in Garnet Crossing for 4 days, had shod 6 horses and made a friend of none of the townspeople, when she heard about Moss Calloway and the bay. She heard it the way she heard most things in those early days, sideways and in pieces. A conversation at the general store that stopped when she walked in and started again at a lower register. A remark from Pruitt, carefully offhand, about how the Calloway Ranch was in a state. A ranch hand who came in to have a mare reshod and who talked while Nell worked, the way people often did when they were watching someone skilled at something and their mouth got ahead of their manners. The bay horse was named Coronado. He was 5 years old and had won every race he had entered in the territory for the past 2 seasons. The Calloway Ranch was the largest operation in the valley, and Moss Calloway had built it from a single quarter section and the stubbornness of a man who had been told too many times what was not possible. Coronado was the pride of the ranch and the subject of a considerable amount of territory-wide wagering, and the horse had been bleeding from the mouth for 3 days, and the veterinarian who came from Las Cruces had looked at the horse and charged $40 and said it was likely a growth, and that if it persisted past the week, Calloway should consider whether he wanted to put the horse down. Nell heard this and kept filing the mare's hoof and said nothing, and thought about what caused bleeding from the mouth in a horse that was otherwise apparently healthy, and the veterinarian's answer did not sit right with her, and she turned it over in her mind the way she turned a piece of iron, looking at it from every angle to find where the problem lived. The ranch hand's name was Purdy. He was talking about the horse the way men talk about a thing they care about more than they want to admit. He said Coronado was eating less, said he stood in the paddock with his head low, said Mr. Calloway had not slept in 3 days and was in a temper that had cleared the bunkhouse of most of its usual conversation. Nell set down the file. She looked at Purdy. "Has anyone looked at the teeth?" she said. Purdy blinked. "What?" "The horse's teeth. Back teeth specifically. Has anyone looked at them?" He stared at her. "The vet came and looked at the... Did he look at the teeth?" A pause. "I don't know what he looked at. He looked at the mouth." "That is not the same thing," Nell said, and picked up the file again. She thought about it that evening while she cooked for herself and Ida on the small iron stove. She thought about it the way she thought about most problems, which was to hold it lightly and not force it, and let it turn until it showed her what it was. A horse bleeding from the mouth, eating less, head low, no other signs of illness that Purdy had mentioned, the bleeding not constant but periodic. She thought about what a growth looked like and how it presented, and she thought about what a broken or infected tooth looked like and how it presented, and the 2 pictures were not the same picture. She was at the Calloway Ranch gate by 6 the next morning. She had left Ida with Hector Pruitt's wife, Cora, who had taken to the child with a warmth that suggested she had been wanting something small and talkative to look after, and had not previously had the opportunity. Nell had her canvas satchel and a small lantern, and the particular expression of a woman who has made a decision and is not planning to revisit it. The ranch was impressive in the early morning light. Long, low buildings of good timber, a main house with a stone foundation, pastures stretching south toward the hills. A working place with the particular density of a place that had been shaped over many years by sustained effort. She could see the care in it. The fencing was sound. The yard was swept. The horses in the near pasture were well-fleshed and alert. Someone had built this with intention and kept it with discipline. She asked a ranch hand sweeping the yard for Mr. Calloway and was told he was in the barn. She went to the barn. He was there. She knew him before she knew him, if that made any sense, which it did not until later. He was standing at the far end of the barn with his back to her, and she could read the exhaustion in his posture the way she could read the weight distribution of a horse that was compensating for pain. He was tall, broad across the shoulder in the way of a man who had done physical work all his life. Dark hair silver at the temples beneath a felt hat that had seen better decades. He wore a leather vest over a collarless shirt, and he was standing at the door of a stall with his arms on the top rail and his head bowed, and he was talking to the horse inside in a voice too low for her to make out the words. She walked the length of the barn and stopped a few feet behind him. "Mr. Calloway." He turned. He was 44, perhaps, a face that weather and years had made angular and unsparing, dark eyes that were sharp with tiredness and something older than tiredness. He looked at her the way he looked at everything, apparently, directly and without social apology, and what she saw in his face was a man who was holding himself together by will alone and did not want anyone to know it. "Who are you?" he said. "Nell Archer. I'm the farrier at Pruitt's. I'd like to look at your horse." A silence. His eyes moved over her, not rudely, assessingly. "Hartley already looked at him," he said. "Hartley told you it might be a growth?" "That's right." "I don't think it's a growth," she said. He was very still. "What do you think it is?" "I won't know until I look, but I'd like to look." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and unlatched the stall door and stepped back. Coronado was a bay with a deep chest and good conformation, and even now, standing with his head lower than it should have been, and the particular dullness in his eye that came from 3 days of pain, she could see what he was. She could see the quality of him. She took a moment at the stall entrance, just a moment, letting him understand she was there, and she spoke to him in the low, even tone she had used on horses since she was old enough to speak, and she watched his ears come toward her one at a time, with the hesitant attention of an animal that is suffering and has not yet decided whether strangers make it better or worse. She moved to his head. She put her left hand on his jaw, just below the ear, and she ran her thumb along the gum line below the back teeth on the right side, gently. He flinched. He pulled away, then steadied. She pressed very slightly at the junction of the second and third molar, and he moved his head hard away from her hand and blew through his nose. She turned to Calloway. "Bring me that lantern." He brought it without a word. She held it up and leaned in close and looked at the back of the right jaw, and what she saw was not a growth. It was a splinter. A long, thin shard of something pale, worked deep into the soft tissue between the second and third molar on the lower right side, where the horse could not expel it, and the pressure of chewing drove it deeper with every meal. It had been there long enough that the tissue around it was inflamed, and the splinter itself was working toward the blood vessels beneath. She pulled back and handed the lantern to Calloway. "It's a splinter," she said. "In the lower right jaw, between the back teeth. Something he ate or something in the stall. It's gone deep, but it hasn't reached the blood vessel yet. If it had, you would know about it." He stared at her. Hartley did not look at the teeth, or if he did not look carefully enough. She kept her voice level. She was not interested in condemning another professional. She was interested in the horse. I can remove it. I have done this before, but it will require him to be still, and there will be some pain when I get purchase on it, and I will need your help to keep his head steady. Another long silence. He was looking at her with an expression she could not entirely read. It had disbelief in it, and something that might have been desperate hope, and underneath both of those things, a wariness that she suspected was simply the default setting of a man who had been disappointed enough times to stop expecting otherwise. "You're certain," he said. "I'm certain it's a splinter. I'm confident I can remove it. I won't promise you the outcome of a procedure before I've performed it. That's the honest answer." Something in his face shifted, very slightly. "All right," he said. It took an hour. Not because the procedure was complex, but because it required patience, and patience had to be earned from the horse before anything else could happen. She spent the first 20 minutes simply standing with Coronado, her hand on his jaw, letting him understand through some medium she could not have named or taught that she was not the source of the pain, but the solution to it. She had seen her husband do this, and she had done it herself for 15 years, and she did not know what it was exactly except that it worked, and that was sufficient. Calloway stood at the horse's left side with his hands on the halter, and he watched her work with an attention that she was aware of the way you are aware of the sun, not by looking at it, but by the warmth of it on the side of your face. When Coronado was as quiet as he was going to get, she took the long-nosed extraction tool from her satchel and worked it carefully into the gap between the molars, found the top of the splinter, and drew it out in one slow, continuous pull that required her to brace her elbow against the stall wall and use her body weight as leverage. The horse threw his head once, hard, and Calloway held him, and she held the tool, and the splinter came free. She held it up to the light. It was nearly 4 inches long, a piece of hardwood doweling, possibly from a broken stall fixture, tapered at one end to a point that had been working its way through soft tissue with every grinding motion of the jaw. She set it on the stall floor. Then she took a small glass bottle of honey and thyme preparation from the satchel and applied it to the wound site with a clean cloth, which caused Coronado to object briefly and then stand, and then, in the way of horses who have been in pain for a long time and have just had that pain removed, do absolutely nothing for a long moment, as if he was not yet certain he could trust the absence of it. She stepped back from the stall. Her hands were shaking slightly, the aftermath of concentration, and she held them together in front of her to still them. Calloway was looking at the splinter on the floor. He crouched down and picked it up and turned it in his fingers. He was quiet for a long time. The barn held its breath around them. Coronado blew softly through his nose and raised his head by 2 inches, which was not much, but was everything. "He'll need the wound watched for a few days," Now said. "There may be some continued irritation as the tissue heals. Keep him on soft feed for the rest of the week. If the bleeding doesn't stop by tomorrow, send for me." Calloway stood. He was still looking at the splinter in his hand. When he looked up at her, his face was doing something she had not expected. Not relief, exactly, though that was there. Something more complicated than that. The look of a man confronting the distance between what he had been prepared to lose and what had, at the last moment, been returned to him. "What do I owe you?" he said. "Whatever you think is fair." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have. I don't have a rate for this. I'm a farrier, not a veterinarian." "You're better than the veterinarian I paid $40, he said. She picked up her satchel. She was aware that this was a moment that wanted to be prolonged, and she was not sure she had the capacity for it just yet. Not with her hands still slightly unsteady, and the light in the barn doing something to the planes of his face that she did not want to be noticing. "I'll check back tomorrow," she said, and left. She was halfway across the yard when she heard his boots behind her. "Mrs. Archer?" She stopped, turned. He was standing in the barn doorway, the splinter still in his hand for some reason, the morning light behind him cutting his silhouette sharp against the straw golden interior. "You came out here on your own," he said. "Nobody sent for you." "No," she said. "Why?" She thought about it for a moment, because it was an honest question and it deserved an honest answer. Because the answer the veterinarian gave didn't fit the symptoms, and I don't like wrong answers when there's an animal suffering from them. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Come to supper tonight, you and whoever you've got." It was not a question exactly, but it was not quite a command either. It was the voice of a man who had spent enough years being obeyed that the difference between those two things had become unclear to him, and who was making, she thought, a genuine and slightly unpracticed attempt at an invitation. "I have a daughter," she said. "She's 3, nearly 4. "All right," he said. She came to supper. Ida, liberated from the small room above the tack room, was magnificent at the Calloway table. She ate everything that was put in front of her with the methodical dedication of a child who has learned not to waste food. And she asked the ranch cook, a weathered man called Bertram, whether he had made the cornbread himself, and when he said he had, she told him it was the best cornbread she had eaten, which she said with the complete sincerity of someone who has not yet learned to moderate compliments. And Bertram looked startled and then pleased, in the way of a man who is rarely told his cooking is appreciated. Calloway sat across the table from Nell and watched all of this with an expression that was carefully neutral and betrayed itself only around the eyes, where something quietly surprised was happening. There were 2 ranch hands at the table, Purdy among them, and the conversation ran along the lines of ranch business and weather and the state of the road to Las Cruces. And Nell mostly listened and watched and understood that she was being observed in return, cataloged, assessed, and that this was simply what happened when you sat at a man's table for the first time, in a place where strangers were rare. After the meal, when the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and Bertram had cleared the plates, Calloway poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them to the table. Ida had fallen asleep on the settle by the fire with her cloth rabbit pressed against her face, which she did in any warm and quiet place within about 20 minutes of sunset, and which Nell had learned to simply allow. She and Calloway sat with their coffee and the fire and the sleeping child and did not talk for a few minutes, which was not uncomfortable. It had the quality of 2 people who have been in the presence of something significant together and are letting it settle. "How long have you been a farrier?" he said finally. 12 years, she said. 8 with my husband, 4 on my own. "Where is your husband?" "Dead, 2 years. He received this with the particular stillness of a man who knows what that sentence costs. "I'm sorry," he said, and it was not a social remark. It was the kind of sorry that comes from acquaintance with the same territory. "Thank you," she said. And then, because the space between them had the quality of something that invited reciprocity, "You're raising your household alone too, I think." A pause. "My wife died when my son was born." He said it the way people say things they have said many times to themselves and almost never to anyone else, worn smooth with private repetition. "The boy is 8. He's in school in Las Cruces. Comes home summers. She thought about a man who had sent his child away to be educated because he believed in it, and who had then been alone in this house all winter, and what that looked like from the inside. She thought she had some idea. "What is his name?" she said. "Thomas." A brief pause. "After my father." "Good name," she said. He looked at her across the table and said nothing, and the fire burned, and outside the coyotes began their evening argument with the dark. She checked on Coronado the next morning and the morning after that. The wound was clean and healing. By the third day, the horse was eating without hesitation, and by the fifth day, he was at the paddock fence with his head up and his ears forward, and when Nell came through the gate, he walked toward her the way horses walk toward someone they have decided to trust, which is with the whole body, without reservation. She was at the fence watching him when Calloway came out of the barn. He stood beside her at the rail, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold morning air. And he looked at the horse and was quiet, and after a moment, she heard him exhale in the long, slow way of a man, releasing something he had been holding for days. "He'll race again," she said, not a question. "In spring," Calloway said, "there's a meet at Socorro. He's been entered for 2 months. He'll be ready." She felt, rather than saw him look at her. "You sound certain." "I watched him move just now. The way he holds his head, the way he placed his feet. The pain was the only thing wrong with him. Without it, he's exactly what he was." A silence. "I knew that," he said quietly. Everyone else was ready to give up on him. She did not say anything to that. There was nothing to say that the moment hadn't already said. They stood at the fence for a while in the pale October morning, the horse grazing a few yards away, and the proximity of it was uncomplicated, and then, suddenly, and without announcement, complicated. She was aware of his shoulder next to hers, the length of him, the way he breathed. She looked at the horse and thought about several other things entirely. It was his ranch foreman who became the problem. His name was Galt. He had been with the Calloway Ranch for 9 years, and he had the particular kind of resentment that grows in a man who has confused proximity to power with power itself. He had a way of speaking to the ranch hands that stopped just short of what you could point to directly, and he had a way of speaking to Nell that was worse. The first time she came to check on Coronado and Galt was in the barn. He watched her work with his arms folded and said nothing for a long time. And then said that it was a strange thing, a woman playing at veterinary work, and that he hoped Mr. Calloway knew what he was paying for. She kept working and did not look at him. "Mr. Calloway knows what he's paying for," she said. The second time, he told Purdy, within Nell's hearing, that he had seen plenty of horse doctors in his time, and none of them wore a dress. The third time, he came to Pruitt's livery on a Wednesday morning and told Hector Pruitt that Mr. Calloway was reconsidering his arrangement with the woman farrier now that Coronado was better, that the ranch would be going back to the outfit in Las Cruces for its farriery work, that Pruitt might want to think about whether he needed the forge space. Pruitt told her this with the apologetic expression of a man delivering news he wishes he could take back. Nell listened. She thanked him. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of the cot with her hands in her lap. She sat there for a while. Ida was playing on the floor with 2 wooden spoons, narrating a complicated drama between them in a low, continuous murmur. The light came through the window in the thin, flat way of late October. She thought about $42, less 2 weeks of expenses. She thought about the forge and the anvil and the 6 horses she had shod, and the small number of people in this town who had looked at her with anything warmer than suspicion. She thought about Coronado walking toward her at the fence with his head up, and a man standing beside her at the rail exhaling all that held breath. She thought about what Galt had actually said, which was that Calloway was reconsidering, and what Galt had not said, which was anything she had heard from Calloway himself. She went to the ranch. She did not have an appointment. She went because she was not the kind of woman who accepted a story from the third party who told it without checking it against the source. She had always known when to wait and when to move, and this was a time to move. She arrived to find Calloway in the yard talking to two ranch hands about a section of the south fence that wanted repairing. She waited at the edge of the yard until he saw her and excused himself and came toward her. And she watched his face, and it told her several things immediately. The first of which was that he was surprised to see her, and the second was that something was wrong, and the third was that he was not going to pretend otherwise. "I heard something from Hector Pruitt this morning," she said. He stopped in front of her. He took off his hat and put it back on, which she had come to understand was a thing he did when he was working out what to say. "Who spoke to Pruitt?" he said. "Galt." A silence. His jaw tightened. "I haven't told Galt anything about my arrangements," he said. "Not that arrangement or any other." She looked at him. "So he spoke for himself?" "It appears so." "And what you actually want?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I want," he said, choosing each word with the care of a man who does not often choose them at all. "The farrier that saved my horse's life to keep working out of Pruitt's forge for as long as she wants to. I want Galt to understand that his opinions about who I hire are not something I invited and are not something I plan to accommodate. And I want—" He stopped. His jaw was tight. He was looking at her with those dark, steady eyes, and she had the feeling again of being seen very directly by someone who did not look away. "I want to ask you to supper again," he said. "Not as a business arrangement. The other kind." She was quiet for a moment. "Galt is going to make this difficult," she said. "Galt works for me. He doesn't like it. What Galt likes is not something I've ever organized my decisions around." He said it flatly, without heat, which was somehow more convincing than anger would have been. "Mrs. Archer, Nell, are you willing to come to supper?" She looked at him. She thought about the road from Albuquerque and the room above the tack room and $42 and Ida on her hip in the October sun, looking at a town that looked back at her with no interest in whatever she was carrying. She thought about a man's hands on either side of a horse's halter, steady, while she did the hard thing. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." Galt escalated on a Friday. He went to the town women. He told 3 or 4 of them, including the formidable Mrs. Dunbar, who ran the dry goods store with her husband and who had strong opinions about the moral state of the valley, that the widow woman from Albuquerque was living at Pruitt's livery in conditions that were not suitable for a child, and that Calloway was entertaining her at the ranch in ways that were not appropriate for a man of his standing, and that the situation reflected badly on everyone involved. Mrs. Dunbar sent her husband to speak to Hector Pruitt on Saturday morning. Pruitt came to Nell in the forge, where she was shaping a set of shoes for a buckskin mare, and he looked at her with a helplessness that she was sorry for, because he was a decent man in an impossible position. "She's threatening to pull her account," he said. "Dunbar's account, and talk to the others." Nell put down the hammer. She looked at the shoe on the anvil, and then she looked at Pruitt. "I see," she said. "I don't want to lose you," he said. "You're the best farrier I've had at this forge in 12 years, but I've got a business." "I understand," she said. "Give me until Monday." She sent a message to Calloway. He came to the livery that same Saturday evening, in the dusk, with his hat in his hands and the look of a man who has been told something on the road and has had the whole ride in to decide what to do about it. He came into the forge, where Nell was finishing the last of the day's work, and he stood in the firelight, and she looked at him and said without preamble, "Galt has gone to the town women." "I know," he said. "Purdy told me. He wants me gone." "I know that too." He turned his hat in his hands once. "He has been with this ranch for 9 years, and I have valued his work, and I have been allowing that value to blind me to what he is, which is a man who will use whatever is available to him to press his view of how things should be arranged. I am done being blind to it." She set down the rasp she was holding. "What does that mean?" "It means I let him go this afternoon." He said it with the simplicity of a man to whom the right decision, once seen, required no elaboration. "It means I'd like to talk to Mrs. Dunbar myself on Monday morning. And it means I would like to know, if you are willing to tell me, whether you are planning to stay in Garnet Crossing." She was quiet. The fire in the forge was burning low, and the barn outside was going dark, and from upstairs she could hear Ida talking to the cloth rabbit in the winding down way she talked before sleep. "This town has not been particularly kind to me," she said. "No," he said, "it hasn't. That is partly a failure of this town, and partly a failure of mine for not speaking sooner." He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking you to let me correct the second part. I can't promise the first part is fixed quickly." She looked at him. This man who had sat in a barn for 3 days, convinced he was going to lose the thing he'd worked longest and hardest for. Who had watched her work with a lantern and trusted her when he had very little reason to trust anything. Who had said her name across a supper table in a way that had felt like something new, like a door opening in a wall she had not known was there. "You went to bat for your horse," she said. "I did." "Before you knew me." "I knew enough," he said. She picked up the rasp again. She turned it in her hands. Then she set it down on the forge shelf and looked at him. "Talk to Mrs. Dunbar on Monday," she said. "And I'll stay through the winter. After that, we'll see." He nodded once. He put his hat back on. He turned to leave and then stopped at the forge room door and looked back at her in the firelight with an expression that he made no effort to compose or conceal. "For what it is worth," he said, "I'd like it to be longer than winter." She looked at the fire and not at him, because the warmth that moved through her at that sentence was something she was not ready to let him see on her face. "We'll see," she said again. He left. She stood at the forge with her hand resting on the anvil's cool edge, and she thought about the way he had held Coronado steady, the way he had crouched in the stall and picked up that splinter and looked at it as if it contained some explanation for something he had not understood, the way he had stood at the fence beside her in the morning cold and simply exhaled, and the world had been different after. She thought it was probably going to be longer than winter. Calloway spoke to Mrs. Dunbar on Monday. She did not know exactly what was said because she was not there, but Pruitt told her afterward that whatever it was had been said plainly and at some length, and that Mrs. Dunbar had been seen leaving the general store with the expression of a woman who has had her position heard but not accommodated, which was at least a kind of resolution, even if it was not a warm one. The town did not change overnight. It rarely did, but there were gradations. The woman who ran the laundry, a practical widow named Coretta Hames, stopped cutting their conversation short and started asking questions about Ida that had genuine interest in them. The preacher, a mild man who held services in a building that also served as the schoolroom, greeted Nell by name on Sunday morning. Purdy, who now worked for Calloway without the shadow of Galt over the bunkhouse, took to calling in at the livery for no obvious reason and staying to talk for longer than the errand required. Coronado recovered completely. She saw it in stages, the way you see a man return from a long illness, not all at once, but in increments that accumulate until one morning you look at him and he is entirely himself again. By mid-November, he was running circuits of the large paddock in the early morning, with his neck arched and his tail up, and the pure animal joy of a body that has stopped hurting. Calloway watched him run one morning from the fence, and Nell stood beside him and felt the warmth of what was on his face without needing to see it directly. "Socorro in spring," she said. "Socorro in spring," he agreed. His son Thomas came home for Christmas. He was 8 years old and had his father's dark eyes and his mother's lighter coloring, and the quality, common to children who spend long periods among adults, of listening with a gravity that was slightly too old for his face. He regarded Nell with careful attention from a distance for the first day, and then, on the second day, came to the livery and asked if he could watch her work. She said yes. He watched for 2 hours without a word. Then he asked whether the angle of the shoe affected the angle of the hoof wall over time, which was a question considerably more precise than anything she had been asked by most adults. She told him yes, it did, and why. And he listened with that grave attention, and then went away and came back the next day with another question. By the end of the week, he was fetching tools when she asked, and keeping the slack tub topped up without being told. And on Friday evening, he told his father at supper, with the directness of a child stating a conclusion he has reached through observation, that Nell was the best at what she did that he had ever seen, which was a large claim for an 8-year-old to make with confidence, and which Calloway received with an expression that held warmth and something that might have been relief. After Thomas had gone to bed, Calloway came to the livery. He came in the way he had been coming in the evenings, quietly and without announcement, and she had a second cup ready for him by the time he reached the top of the stairs, because she had started doing that sometime around the 3rd week of November, without quite noticing when the habit had taken hold. He sat down across the small table and wrapped his hands around the cup and looked at her. "Thomas likes you," he said. "I like him," she said. "He's going to be remarkable." "He already is." A pause. "He asked me last night whether you were going to stay." She looked at her cup. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I hoped so, that it was your decision." He was quiet for a moment. "I told him that there are some things you can't push. You can only make it clear that the door is open, and then wait." She looked up. He was looking at her with those steady dark eyes and the fire between them and the quiet of the room and Ida asleep in the small cot in the corner, one small hand curled under her chin. "Kate Sutton told me once," she said, and then stopped, because she had not meant to say someone else's name, and she did not even know where the name had come from, only that it felt like the name of someone she might have been in a different story. She looked at her hands. "I mean, someone told me once that the bravest thing a person can do is let themselves be seen." He was quiet. "I have not been brave about that," she said. "For a long time I have kept things where I could manage them. Ida, the tools, the road, things I understood." She looked up. "You are something I don't know how to manage." His mouth did something. Not quite a smile, but the closest thing she had seen on him. "Neither do I," he said. "I have been trying to be sensible about this since October, and I am not succeeding." "Then stop trying," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His hand was large and scarred and warm, and she felt the steadiness of it the way she had felt it in the barn, holding the horse still while she did the hard thing. and she thought that whatever came next, she was not sorry she had come to Garnet Crossing. She was not sorry about any of it. They were married in February, on a day when the frost was still on the ground, but the sky was the hard, deep blue that comes before spring. The ceremony was short and plain, and attended by the people who mattered, which turned out to be more people than she would have predicted in October. Pruitt and Cora, Purdy and 2 other ranch hands, Coretta Hames from the laundry, the preacher who held services in the schoolroom, Thomas Calloway in his best shirt, standing beside his father with an expression of cautious satisfaction, as though a calculation he had been running for weeks had finally come out right. Ida sat in Cora Pruitt's lap throughout the ceremony and explained in a stage whisper to the cloth rabbit that the man at the front was going to be her papa now, and that the cornbread at supper would be very good. The forge at Pruitt's stayed Nell's to use. That was part of the arrangement, because she was not the kind of woman who put down her tools when she married, and Calloway was not the kind of man who would have asked her to. The Calloway Ranch got its farriery work done by the best hand in the valley, which everyone eventually acknowledged, even if some of them took longer about it than others. Coronado ran at Socorro in April. He won by 4 lengths on a day when the cottonwoods along the Rio Grande were coming into leaf, and the air smelled of water and new grass, and the particular freshness that comes when the land decides to start over. Calloway stood at the rail and watched him run, and Nell stood beside him with her shoulder against his arm, and Thomas was on her other side, gripping the rail with both hands and saying something emphatic and joyful that she felt more than heard. She thought about the morning in October when she had walked into a barn where no one had sent for her. A horse with his head down, a man with his back to her, and a problem that everyone else had been prepared to accept as unsolvable. She had simply looked at it differently. She had looked at where the pain actually was and reached for it without flinching and held on until it came free. She thought that was, when you got down to it, the only way she had ever known how to live. The horse crossed the finish line. The crowd in the rail enclosure made a sound like weather. Thomas turned to his father, and his father picked him up, briefly, the way fathers do when a feeling is too large to be contained in ordinary posture. And Calloway looked at Nell over the boy's head with dark eyes, full of everything neither of them had been able to say in October, and most of what they had managed to say since. She looked back at him and did not look away. There are women who arrive in a place with nothing but what they carry, and who build something out of the air and the grit and the sheer refusal to accept that what seems impossible is actually impossible. They are not loud about it. They do not announce themselves. They simply arrive. They look at the problem that everyone else has turned away from. They reach in. If you have ever been that woman or loved one, or been lifted out of a dark place by one, then you know who Nell Archer was. And you know that the bravest things are often done quietly, in barns and forges and cold October mornings, by people who do not wait to be asked. If this story reached you today, please give it a like and tell a friend who would love it. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story from this valley. And share with us in the comments, have you ever seen something others missed and stepped forward anyway? We would love to know. Until next time, ride safe and hold your people close.